The boardroom on the 63rd floor went silent when Victoria Ashbourne pointed at the floor in front of Gavin Rourke. "Kneel. Apologize to me in front of everyone, and I will consider letting you leave with a little dignity." Not one of the executives around that table dared to look at the single father in the worn coat. Gavin did not get angry. I watched him set down his folder, take out his phone, and dial a single number. Victoria laughed at him. "Calling your lawyer?" Gavin looked her straight in the eye. "No." The other end picked up. "Conrad, we have a problem. I have spent enough years inside towers like this one to know that the lobby is where a company tells you exactly what it worships. At Ashbourne Meridian Group, the lobby worshipped a rival. It worshipped black cars pulling up to the curb on Monday morning, and glass doors that opened before a hand ever touched them, and the small choreography of assistants moving half a step behind the people they served. So when Gavin Rourke came through those doors alone at 7:40 in the morning, carrying a leather briefcase that had been repaired at one corner, the building did not know what to do with him. He wore a gray coat that had seen a decade of winters. He held a visitor badge issued by an office on the 70th floor, and nobody at the front desk had thought to look closely at which office that was. I knew things about him that morning that nobody else in that building knew. I knew he had woken at 5:30 to make lunch for a 9-year-old girl who liked her sandwiches cut on the diagonal. I knew he had stood in his kitchen, reading a financial appendix while the coffee brewed, and that he had underlined the same paragraph 3 times, and that the third time he had stopped underlining and simply stared at the page because he had recognized the shape of something rotten. I knew that his wife had died 4 years earlier in a hospital 11 blocks from where he now stood, and that he had walked out of a corner office 2 weeks after the funeral without asking anyone for permission. None of that was written on his badge. The badge said guest, and in a place like this, guest meant nothing. Victoria Ashbourne crossed the lobby at 7:44 with 4 people trailing her. She moved the way certain people move when they have never once in their lives waited for an elevator. Her coat was charcoal, cut to the millimeter. Her heels sounded like a metronome on the polished stone, and every employee within 20 feet found a reason to look busy. She was 43 years old, the third generation of a family that had made money before the Second World War and had never seriously considered losing it, and she had run this company for 2 years and 7 months, with a philosophy so simple it barely needed words. Title equaled worth. Everything else was noise made by people who had failed to acquire a title. She saw Gavin at the desk and made her judgment in under 3 seconds. A vendor. Some small operator who had gotten himself a meeting with a procurement manager and was now trying to talk his way upstairs. I watched the calculation move across her face, and I watched her decide to enjoy it. She stopped. Her entourage stopped behind her, like a wave hitting a seawall. "Can I help you find something?" she said, in a tone that made the offer of help sound like a threat. Gavin told her, without any particular emphasis, that he had been invited to the senior strategy meeting on 63. Her eyes went down to his shoes and back up to his collar, taking inventory, pricing him out. "That floor is for people who make decisions," she said. "Not for people who deliver invoices." Gavin did not answer. That was the first thing about him that unsettled her, though she would not have admitted it under oath. She had built an entire operating system out of other people's fear, and this man had simply declined to install it. He looked at her the way a surveyor looks at a plot of land, noting the slope and the drainage. And then he turned back to the receptionist and asked politely whether the badge needed to be scanned at the turnstile or at the elevator bank. Behind Victoria, her chief of staff developed a sudden fascination with his phone. The lobby manager, a man who had worked there 19 years, began to feel the specific nausea of someone watching a mistake he is not permitted to prevent. Mallory Keene arrived then, coming out of the security lane with a tablet in her hand, and she stopped so fast she nearly dropped it. She was 34, the director of internal control, and she had spent 11 months learning exactly how much truth this company could tolerate before it started punishing her for it. On her tablet was a restricted calendar entry, the kind that comes down from the board secretary rather than from operations, and on that entry was a name. She looked up at the man in the worn coat, and I watched her understand something in one clean motion. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I'll take you up, myself." Victoria's expression cooled by several degrees. It was one thing to have a vendor in her lobby. It was another to watch her own control director address him. "With respect, Mallory," she said, "the executive elevator is being held for important guests this morning. Show him to the service car." There was no important guest. There was no reason. There was only a woman establishing in front of witnesses the difference between people who ride up the spine of the building and people who ride up its back. Mallory's jaw tightened. Gavin said, "That's fine," and meant it, and somehow that made it worse for everyone except him. Before they reached the service bank, he stopped in front of the marble wall where the company mark was cut into the stone. 3 interlocking lines rising to the right. He stood there for perhaps 8 seconds, long enough that Mallory turned to see what had caught him. It was not the look of a man impressed by a logo. It was the look of a man reading his own handwriting on a wall he had not visited in years, checking whether the letters had changed. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked on. In the elevator, with the doors closing on the polished lobby and the receding sound of heels, Mallory asked him quietly whether Chairman Whitmore had truly been the one to request his presence. Gavin watched the floor numbers climb. "He did not call me here for something small," he said. The 63rd floor conference room had a table cut from a single slab of walnut and a window wall that made the rest of Manhattan look like a scale model built to flatter whoever sat at the head. 11 executives were already seated when Gavin came in, and the agenda in front of each of them concerned the acquisition of a technology company called Halverson Dynamic for $4.1 billion. Victoria had been building this deal for 19 months. It was going to be the thing her name attached to permanently, the transaction that would let her step out from under her grandfather's portrait in the 12th floor hallway and stand on her own ground. She wanted it signed by Friday. She had told the market as much in language that was careful enough to be legal and confident enough to be a promise. She assumed Gavin was an outside risk assessor, one of those interchangeable men the finance function rents by the week to put a signature at the bottom of a memo. When he took an open chair 3 seats from the head of the table, she looked at that chair the way a duchess looks at a stain. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "the far end, please." And then, because a lesson delivered privately is not a lesson at all, she said it to the room. "Consultants advise. Executives decide." Gavin gathered his folder and his briefcase and moved to the last chair on the left, the one nobody used, the one with the leg that caught slightly on the carpet. He sat down. He thanked her. 2 of the younger vice presidents looked at the table because they had just watched something they did not want to remember. There was a small silence of the kind that has weight. Nathaniel Cross, the chief financial officer, 51 years old, and possessed of a lifelong instinct for standing next to whoever is winning, said that the structure had been reviewed thoroughly. Gavin asked who had reviewed it. Nathaniel said the deal team. Gavin asked which member. Nathaniel said he would circle back. Gavin then asked about a chain of 4 holding entities between the target and its Singapore-registered logistics partner, naming each one in order, and asked why 3 of them had been formed within the same 6-week window in the previous spring. He was not aggressive. That was the disorienting part. He asked questions the way a doctor palpates an abdomen, gently, watching your face for where it hurts. Victoria cut him off. "You are paid to read numbers," she said, "not to teach me how to run a corporation." Gavin closed the appendix and said that if the agreement was signed in its current structure, Ashbourne Meridian would be assuming a contingent financial obligation that had not been fully disclosed to the board, and that in his judgment, the exposure was material. Material was a careful word. Everyone at that table knew exactly how careful it was. Nathaniel's pen stopped moving. Elias Ward, the general counsel, 46 and constitutionally allergic to surprises, wrote 3 words on his pad and underlined them. Victoria smiled the thin smile she used instead of raising her voice. "Have you ever actually run a company large enough to earn the right to say that sentence in this room?" Gavin said, "Yes." She asked which one. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze until the silence became her problem rather than his, and she filled it with a laugh and a small shake of the head, and told the room that they would continue. She had decided he was bluffing. It was the most comfortable available conclusion, and Victoria had a lifelong habit of choosing comfortable conclusions and calling them judgment. What she did not see, because she was looking at the screen, was Elias Ward leaning forward 2 inches to read the cover of the folder Gavin had brought. In the lower right corner there was a routing stamp, a 6-character alphanumeric string above a small square seal. Elias had seen that format exactly 4 times in 8 years, and every one of those times the document had come out of the office of the chairman of the board, hand-carried, logged separately from the corporate records system. He sat back very slowly. Whatever the man at the end of the table was, he had not been hired through procurement, and he had not been vetted by the chief executive, and that meant somebody above her had gone around her. After the coffee break, Victoria stopped talking about Halverson Dynamic and started talking about Gavin. It was, I think, the first genuinely reckless thing she did that day, and she did it because a room that had been entirely hers for 2 years had briefly turned its head towards someone else. She asked him, in front of everyone, what his engagement fee was. He told her the truth, a flat figure, which was in fact lower than the retainer the company paid its third-tier advisory firms. She let the number sit. Then she said, "Do not confuse the fact that we pay you with the idea that you belong in this room." He did not flush. He did not glance around for allies, which is what men usually do at that moment, and which is what she had been waiting to enjoy. He asked Nathaniel to bring up Financial Appendix 17. Nathaniel said there was no Appendix 17. Gavin opened his laptop, turned it slightly, and read out the document control number, the revision date, the internal owner code, and the name of the analyst who had last saved the file, at 11:51 on a Tuesday night. The air in that room changed temperature. I have watched a great many meetings go wrong, and there is a specific stillness that arrives when 11 people simultaneously realize that the least important person present has better information than they do. Mallory Keene spoke up. She said, carefully, that the document had existed in the system as of the 2nd week of March, and that it had subsequently been moved to a restricted access tier. Victoria asked who had moved it. Mallory said she had submitted 2 written requests for that answer and had not received one. The general counsel wrote another line on his pad. Nathaniel Cross said something about routine data hygiene and heard in his own voice how thin it sounded. Gavin then laid out, without accusation, the pattern. A valuation model revised upward 11 days after the target's auditor issued a going concern qualification on one of its subsidiaries. An audit checkpoint waived by written exception. A risk committee briefing rescheduled 3 times and finally circulated as a summary rather than a full package. He said that taken individually, each of these was ordinary. He said that taken together, they described a transaction being moved towards signature faster than the board's ability to see what was inside it, and that whoever was doing that was either careless or intentional, and that he had been asked to determine which. Victoria heard that as an accusation aimed at her chair, which it was, and she responded the way she always responded to pressure, by converting it into a question of authority. "This meeting is over," she said. "Mr. Rourke, you will leave the building." Gavin stood, unhurried, and said that he had not completed his assignment. "You have no assignment here anymore," she told him. She keyed her phone and asked the floor security lead to come up and provide an escort, and she said the word escort with visible pleasure, the way a person says a word they have been saving. He packed his briefcase. Then he took out a sealed envelope, cream-colored, unmarked on the back, and set it on the table in front of Mallory Keene. "If I am removed from this building," he said, "open this." He said it quietly, to her, but the room had gone silent enough that it carried, and Victoria heard every word. She came around the table faster than her dignity should have allowed, and took the envelope out from under Mallory's hand. She had it half-turned toward the light before she saw the front of it. Printed across the face, in the plain block typeface used by exactly one office in that corporation, were 4 words: confidential. Board oversight only. Victoria did not open it. I watched her want to, and I watched her calculate what opening it would mean. If the thing inside had a distribution list she was not on, and I watched her set it back down on the walnut with a carefulness that told the room more than any confession could have. She said, "We will handle this properly." Nobody answered her, and in that pause, for the first time in 2 years and 7 months, several members of her executive committee were looking at their chief executive instead of at the person she was attacking, and what was on their faces was not loyalty. It was arithmetic. Elias Ward went back to his office, closed the door, and did what cautious lawyers do when the ground moves. He pulled records, not the corporate database, which he now assumed to be incomplete, but the archived transaction files in the legal vault, the paper ones, the boxes from before the migration. It took him 90 minutes to find what he was looking for, and when he found it, he sat down on the floor of the vault room, with the folder open on his knees, because he had run out of interest in standing. 12 years earlier, a private company called Rourke Systems had built a predictive routing and load balancing platform that could see congestion in a supply chain 4 days before it happened. The company had 11 employees. Its co-founder and chief architect had been a 27-year-old named Gavin Rourke. In the autumn of that year, Ashbourne Meridian Group had acquired Rourke Systems, and the platform had been folded into the company's operations spine, and over the following decade it had become the invisible nervous system for roughly a third of the group's logistics, warehousing, and freight scheduling. Every executive in that building used it 40 times a day, without knowing it had a name. And yet the name Gavin Rourke had almost entirely disappeared from the corporate history. There was no interview. There was no photograph in any annual report. Elias found exactly one internal reference to him after the acquisition, a single line in a governance memorandum from 8 years back, and it did not describe him as a former founder. It described him as the counterparty to a protective instrument. That phrase sent Elias into the second box, and the second box was where the day stopped being a bad day and became a different kind of day entirely. Gavin had not taken the acquisition in cash. He had taken part of it, and the rest he had converted into a class of preferred interest held through a trust, and the terms of that instrument had been negotiated personally with the chairman of the board because the technology being purchased was classified as strategic core infrastructure. The instrument granted no operating authority. It granted no seat, no vote on ordinary business, no ability to hire or dismiss anyone. What it granted was narrow and enormous. Where a proposed transaction created a credible risk of material impairment to designated core assets, the holder could compel the board to conduct a formal reconsideration of that transaction before execution, and that compulsion could not be waived by management, not by the chief financial officer, not by the chief executive. Her office was the size of a small apartment and contained one photograph of her grandfather. She did not offer Gavin a seat, which meant nothing to him, and she did not apologize, which meant something to her. Instead, she slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a mutual non-disclosure and release agreement and a consulting termination payment, and the figure on the payment line had 6 digits and began with an 8. The terms were simple. He would conclude his engagement, transfer his working papers to the chief financial officer's team, and refrain, permanently, from characterizing the Halverson transaction to any party inside or outside the corporation. Gavin read it. He read all of it, which she had not expected, taking almost 4 minutes, and then he closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk with 2 fingers. Victoria's mouth curved. "You think you're worth more," she said. "No," he said. "I think my silence isn't something you have the right to buy." Then she picked up her phone and told her chief of staff to reconvene the full executive committee at 2 o'clock and to prepare a presentation. She was no longer trying to remove Gavin Rourke from her building. She was going to remove him from the belief of every person in her leadership team, permanently and in public, because a man who could not be bought could still be made ridiculous, and ridicule was a currency she had never once failed to spend. At 2 o'clock there were 19 people in the 63rd floor conference room, which was 8 more than the morning, and every one of the additions was there because Victoria wanted an audience. She began by thanking Gavin for his contributions in a voice pitched precisely, to signal that no contribution had occurred. Then she nodded at her chief of staff, and the window wall dimmed, and the screen came alive, and on the screen was a slide titled Advisor Background Review. What followed was true in the way that a photograph of a man's worst afternoon is true. There was a project called Meridian Freight Optimization, launched under Gavin's direction 11 years earlier, which had been shut down after 14 months. There was a venture investment in a cold chain sensor company that had lost $9 million. There was a gap of 4 years in his professional record, and Victoria walked to the screen and put her finger on that gap. He left the corporate world entirely, she said. He tells people it was to raise his daughter. She let the word daughter hang there just slightly too long, and I watched 2 women at that table go rigid with anger they could not afford to express. She was building towards something, and she got there. Perhaps you have been out of the game so long that you've forgotten the difference, she said, between a man who used to be successful and a man who still matters. There was a sound in the room, not quite a laugh, from 3 or 4 people who had learned that failing to react was itself a form of insubordination. Nathaniel Cross studied the grain of the table. Elias Ward, who now knew exactly what was standing at the end of the room, felt the specific horror of a man watching a car accident he had chosen not to prevent. Gavin let the silence finish. Then he asked one question, and he asked it without heat. "Are you certain you want to continue this conversation in front of witnesses?" Victoria heard fear in that. It is what she was trained to hear, because in her world a man who mentions witnesses is a man preparing to negotiate. "Completely certain," she said. "All right," Gavin said, and he stood up, and he did not go to the screen, and he did not raise his voice, and he began to ask questions about the transaction. Who approved the exception that waived the pre-signing audit checkpoint on the target's subsidiary accounts? Nobody answered. He named the exception number. Who instructed the internal control function to defer the March risk report? Mallory Keene's hands were flat on the table, and her breathing had changed. Who authorized the transfer of Financial Appendix 17 to restricted access, and on whose written request, and why does the audit trail for that transfer show a service account rather than a named user? Each question was narrow, each question had a documentary answer, and each answer, when the room mentally supplied it, pointed at the same suite of offices 2 floors up. Victoria denied. She denied crisply and repeatedly, and with the confidence of a woman who had never had to produce a receipt. She said the deal team had operated within delegated authority. She said internal control had its own reporting failures. She said Appendix 17 had been withdrawn because it contained an error, and when Gavin asked what the error was, she said she was not going to litigate spreadsheet formatting. Then Gavin took a single printed page out of his folder and set it on the walnut and slid it toward the center of the table, and he did not say a word about it. It was an electronic mail message sent at 9:08 in the evening on the 11th of March from her executive assistant to the head of data governance. And it read as instructions of that kind always read. Polite and passive and utterly clear, and the second line of it began with the phrase, "Per Victoria's direction." I watched her look at that page. I watched her make the choice. And I want to be exact, because everything that happened to Victoria Ashbourne afterward was made possible by the next 9 seconds. She could have said, "I need to review this." She could have said nothing. What she said was, if my assistant sent that, she sent it without my knowledge, and she will be dealt with accordingly. Her assistant was standing 8 feet behind her, against the wall, holding a laptop, and had worked for her for 2 years. The woman's face did not move at all, which was somehow the worst part. Victoria understood that she was losing the room, and because she had exactly one instrument, she reached for it harder. She stopped defending and started prosecuting. She announced that Gavin Rourke had accessed restricted internal documents without authorization, that he had removed proprietary material from the premises, and that he was now using it to threaten the reputations of the corporation's officers. She said the word criminal. She keyed her phone and told security to come to the room, and this time 2 guards actually came in and stood by the door, large men in gray blazers who looked profoundly unhappy to be there. Gavin said, I had the right to access those documents. Victoria laughed, and it was a real laugh, sharp with relief, because she thought he had finally made an unforced error. What right, she said. On whose authority? Show the room. Gavin did not answer. That refusal, the third of the day, was what finished her judgment entirely. She read silence as emptiness. She had been reading silence as emptiness her whole life. She wanted a total victory now, not a settlement. She said that the corporation would not pursue him, not civilly, not criminally, on one condition. He would apologize to her. He would apologize to the executive committee, and he would state, on the record, in front of all of them, that his findings regarding the Halverson transaction were unfounded and that he had exceeded his mandate. Gavin said no. She walked toward him. 12 steps around the long side of the walnut table, unhurried, heels landing like punctuation, and she stopped close enough that the two people nearest had to lean back. You want to walk out of this building without a lawsuit, she said. It was not a question. He looked at her, and there was nothing in his face that she could use. Then Victoria Ashbourne raised her hand and pointed at the carpet directly. The room died. I have been in rooms during layoffs and rooms during depositions, and I have never heard 19 people stop breathing at the same time. Someone's pen rolled off a legal pad and hit the floor, and it sounded like a dropped plate. Nathaniel Cross, who had spent 30 years learning to feel the direction of power the way a sailor feels wind, closed his eyes briefly, because even he knew she had gone past the edge of the map. Mallory Keene said, "Victoria," and got no further. The two security men looked at each other with the expression of men calculating how much of this would end up in a statement they would have to sign. Gavin looked down at the carpet where she was pointing. He looked at it for perhaps 3 seconds, and I do not think he was considering it. I think he was memorizing it. Then he looked up and around the room, unhurried, at the general counsel, at the chief financial officer, at the assistant against the wall, at the young vice president who had gone pale, taking each of them in as though he were counting witnesses for the record, which is precisely what he was doing. He was not angry. He did not raise his voice. He said, "All right. I think it's time to call the one person who needs to hear this." Victoria's mouth twisted. "Your lawyer?" Gavin took out his phone. "No." He pressed a single stored number and set the phone on the table, and he did something small that everyone would remember afterward, which was to tap the speaker icon before it began to ring. Twice. 3 times. The line clicked. "Conrad," he said, "we have a problem." Victoria's face went the color of the walnut. She knew exactly one Conrad. For 2 full seconds she tried to take the room back. "He is performing for you," she said quickly, to no one and everyone. "This is theater. Anyone can dial a number, anyone can say a name." Then the voice came out of the speaker, unhurried, gravel dry, the voice of a 68-year-old man who has not needed to raise it since 1994. "Gavin, I'm listening. Have you finished going through the file?" Conrad asked. "Enough of it," Gavin said. "Enough to conclude that we cannot sign this transaction on Friday." The word "we" landed on Victoria like a hand on the back of her neck. She stepped forward and spoke over the table. "Conrad, I think you're being given a distorted picture. This individual was engaged as an outside assessor. He has exceeded every boundary of his mandate, and he has just refused a lawful instruction in front of my entire leadership team." Conrad Whitmore did not raise his voice. He said, "Victoria." She stopped. "I know exactly who Gavin Rourke is." Conrad kept going, and what he said next he said for the benefit of the room, not for her. He explained that 6 weeks earlier, the board's risk committee had received a written warning it could not reconcile with what management was reporting. He explained that he had therefore commissioned an independent review outside the normal advisory framework, reporting to the chairman's office alone, because a review routed through the executive suite would have told him only what the executive suite wanted him to know. He said the review had been given access under board authority. He said the engagement letter had been signed in his own hand on the 12th of June. Victoria tried one more time, and I almost admired the reflex. "He is a consultant," she said. "Whatever access you gave him, that is what he is." "No," Conrad said. "He is the person to whom I delegated direct representation of the chairman's office for the duration of this inquiry." You could see the executive committee recalculate in real time. Faces turned toward Gavin, then away from him, then toward Victoria, and the direction of the looking had entirely reversed since morning. Because what had just been established, on an open line, in front of 19 witnesses, 2 security officers, and a general counsel taking contemporaneous notes, was that the chief executive of Ashbourne Meridian Group had ordered the personal representative of her own board chairman to get on his knees on the carpet and beg her forgiveness. "Nobody leaves that room," he said. The line went dead. 20 minutes is not a long time. It was that afternoon. The screen still glowed with the slide about Gavin's 4-year gap, and no one had the authority or the nerve to turn it off, so it sat there humming like a confession. The security men withdrew to the corridor without being told. Victoria did not sit down. She stood at the head of the table with her hands flat on the walnut, and she was doing the thing that had always worked before, which was to reconstruct the situation into one where she still held the only chair that mattered. She spoke to Gavin without looking at him. "Whatever that call was," she said, "it does not change the fact that I am the chief executive of this corporation." Gavin was putting the printed email back into his folder. "Yes," he said. "Currently." Conrad Whitmore came in at 3:11 with the board secretary and 2 independent directors, and he did not look like a man arriving to save anybody. He looked like a man arriving to count damage. He was tall, slightly stooped, in a suit that had been expensive during a previous presidential administration, and he had the unhurried physicality of someone who has never in his adult life had to prove he was allowed to be somewhere. There was no shouting. He asked everyone to sit down. 19 people sat down. Victoria sat down last, at the head of the table, which by then had become the most exposed seat in the room. Conrad turned first to Mallory Keene, and he asked her a single question. "Tell me about Appendix 17. Mallory had rehearsed this conversation in her head for 4 months, in the hope that it would never happen. She spoke for 6 minutes. She said that in February her team had modeled the target's off-balance sheet obligations and produced a range that exceeded the deal's contingency provision by a factor of 3. She said she had raised it in writing on the 28th of February, again on the 9th of March, and again on the 2nd of April. She said each time she was instructed to hold the report pending further guidance from the chief executive's office, and that, after the 3rd request, her access to the deal data room had been narrowed to summary level, and that she had been told during her performance review in April that she was perceived as an obstacle to strategic execution. Victoria said that was a distortion. She said internal control had been asked for rigor, not delay. Conrad did not argue with her. He simply asked the board secretary to note that the documents referenced would be produced. Then he turned to Gavin and said, "Walk them through it." Gavin did it in 11 minutes, without slides. He described a target company whose growth in the past 3 years had been financed by a structure that moved liabilities into affiliated entities, and then leased capacity back at rates that only worked if freight volumes held. He described 2 guarantees that survived a change of control, and one that accelerated on it. He described a receivables facility with a covenant tested quarterly, and he explained that on the current trailing figures, the covenant would breach in the 2nd quarter after closing, and that the breach would pull the guaranteed obligations onto the acquirer's balance sheet. He gave the number. In the first year following signature, the realistic downside exposure was between $410 and $630 million. Victoria played her last card, and she played it well, because she was not a stupid woman. She was a woman whose intelligence had never been pointed at anything but her own position. "You cannot destroy a $4 billion transaction," she said to Conrad on the word of a consultant. Conrad Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. "I am not relying on the word of a consultant," he said. The room waited. "I am relying on the word of one of the holders of this corporation's protective voting interest." Every head at that table turned toward the man in the worn coat at the far end. Conrad laid it out plainly, because he had come to end the ambiguity, not to enjoy it. 12 years ago, when Ashbourne Meridian acquired Rourke Systems, the seller had declined to take the full consideration in cash. The technology was not an ordinary bolt-on. Within 4 years it had become the operating substrate for the group's freight and warehousing network. the thing that everything else stood on, and the acquisition agreement had recognized that in advance by classifying it as designated core infrastructure. In exchange for a reduced cash payment, the seller had received a class of preferred interest held through a trust, and attached to that interest was a protective covenant negotiated with the chairman personally. Conrad was careful about the limits, and I want to be equally careful, because the limits are the reason none of this was a fantasy. The instrument gave Gavin Rourke no operating authority whatsoever. He could not appoint anyone, he could not dismiss anyone, he could not vote on compensation, strategy, dividends, or the ordinary business of the corporation, and he certainly could not remove a chief executive with a telephone call. What he could do was one thing, and only one thing: where a proposed transaction presented a credible risk of material impairment to the designated core assets, the trust could require the board to open a formal reconsideration of that transaction before execution, with independent verification, and management could not waive that requirement or vote it down. Then Conrad told them the rest, because the rest was the part that reframed the entire day. Gavin Rourke had not been pushed out of this corporation, he had left it. 4 years earlier, in the space of 2 weeks, he had buried his wife and become the only parent of a 5-year-old girl, and he had walked into the chairman's office and resigned an executive role that most of the people in that room would have traded a decade of their lives for. He had not surrendered his interest. He had simply stopped exercising it. For 4 years he had drawn nothing, attended nothing, and asked for nothing, and that is precisely why almost none of the current leadership team had ever heard his name. Victoria Ashbourne had been hired 18 months after he stepped back. She had inherited an organization built partly on his architecture and had never once been curious about who drew it. "I gave you a great many opportunities to talk about the numbers," he said. "You turned it into a question of rank." Then Conrad Whitmore asked for the envelope. Mallory Keene slid it down the table. The chairman opened it with a pocket knife, unfolded the contents, and read for 4 minutes in complete silence, while 19 people watched him turn pages. And what was inside was not only a transaction memorandum. That was the first 11 pages. The remaining 31 were something else entirely. There were 9 sworn interview summaries, taken under board privilege, over the previous 5 weeks, from current and former employees across 4 functions. A financial analyst who had been instructed to revise a sensitivity table and had preserved both versions. A regional operations manager who had objected to a capacity forecast and had been moved into a role with no direct reports within 6 weeks. 2 members of the internal audit team who described complaints being routed out of the formal channel and resolved informally at the executive floor. A human resources business partner who had escalated a retaliation concern in November and had received no written response of any kind. There was a chart, 1 page, showing the intake and disposition of 91 internal reports over 26 months, and the disposition column told a story that required no adjectives. Gavin had not been hired to review a deal. He had been retained by the chairman's office because the board suspected that the entire internal control system of Ashbourne Meridian Group was being quietly disabled from the top, and because suspicion is not evidence, and because a board that acts on suspicion destroys itself. The Halverson transaction was the test. It was the largest decision the organization would make that year, and it was the cleanest possible place to observe whether the safeguards still functioned, or whether they had become decorative. I watched Victoria arrive at the understanding, and it was worse than any humiliation anyone could have designed for her. From the instant Gavin Rourke walked through the lobby doors that morning, she had been demonstrating, in front of witnesses, with escalating enthusiasm, every single behavior the board had privately been trying to verify. Nobody had entrapped her. Nobody had asked her to look at a man's coat and decide he was furniture. Nobody had instructed her to send him to the service elevator, or to move him to the end of the table, or to put his dead wife on a slide, or to feed her own assistant to the room, or to point at the carpet. Her character had supplied the corroboration that 5 weeks of privileged interviews could not. Conrad Whitmore did 4 things in the next 11 minutes. He suspended the Halverson transaction pending independent verification, effective immediately, and instructed the board secretary to notify the target's advisors before the close of business. He directed Nathaniel Cross to surrender the complete deal file, including all model versions and the exception log, to an outside audit firm, and told him that his personal cooperation would be noted either way. He asked Elias Ward to preserve all communications related to Appendix 17, and then he asked Victoria to leave the room while the independent directors convened. She stood up. To her credit, and she deserves this much, she did not cry and she did not beg. She looked down the length of the walnut table at the man at the far end, and she said the only thing she had left, which was an accusation. "You planned this." Gavin picked up his old briefcase. "No," he said. "I planned to examine a transaction, the rest was your choice." The independent directors met for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The announcement came out at 6:50 that evening. Internally first, 4 paragraphs of the flattest language the corporate secretary could construct, and it said that Victoria Ashbourne had been placed on administrative suspension from the office of chief executive pending the completion of a governance review, and that an interim executive committee would report directly to the board. I want to be clear about what she was suspended for, because it was not for pointing at a carpet. Discourtesy does not remove a chief executive of a public corporation, and it should not. She was suspended because a documented pattern existed of interference with the internal control function, of retaliation against employees who escalated concerns, of complaints being diverted out of an audited process, and of a deliberate effort to move a $4 billion transaction to signature after material risk had been identified in writing 3 times and suppressed. Everything that happened in that boardroom mattered only because it was witnessed evidence of the thing the paperwork already described. She came out of the room at 7:05, and the building, which had spent 2 years and 7 months arranging itself around her, had already stopped. There was no cluster of assistants in the corridor. Nobody stood up. The door to the executive elevator lobby, which had opened for her approximately 4,000 times, stayed shut until she put her own hand on it. Gavin was at the end of the corridor, closing the clasp on his briefcase. Victoria stopped a few feet away, and she looked at him with something that was not quite hatred, because hatred requires energy she no longer had. "What do you want?" she said. "An apology?" Gavin looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. Then he turned his head slightly toward the conference room, where Mallory Keene was gathering 4 months of unsent reports into a folder, and toward the assistant, who was still standing against the wall, with a laptop she no longer had a reason to hold, and toward the young vice president, who had gone pale, and who would go home that night and tell his wife he had almost said something. "If you actually want to apologize," he said, "start with the people who never had the power to fight back." Then he walked to the service elevator, out of habit, and wrote it down. 7 weeks later, the independent audit confirmed the exposure. The number came in at $490 million of contingent obligation that had never been presented to the board, and the Halverson transaction was terminated by mutual agreement on a Thursday afternoon in a 2-sentence release that nobody outside the industry noticed. Ashbourne Meridian Group announced a governance restructuring in the same quarter. The internal control function was pulled out from under the finance organization and given a direct reporting line to the audit committee, and Mallory Keene was named to run it with a budget she had been requesting for 2 years and a mandate she had never expected to receive. Nathaniel Cross resigned during the review, citing family reasons, and was not replaced from inside. Victoria Ashbourne lost the office permanently when the board concluded its process in the autumn, and the announcement thanked her for her service in 11 words. Conrad Whitmore asked Gavin to come back. Not as an advisor, as chief operating officer, with a seat, a mandate, and compensation that would have made the offer difficult for almost anyone. Gavin declined it in a single conversation. He accepted instead a limited advisory role reporting to the board, 40 days a year, no operating authority, no direct reports. His reason was not humility, and it was not bitterness. He had spent 11 years trading hours for altitude, and then he had spent one afternoon in a hospital corridor, learning precisely what those hours had cost, and he had decided that no title would ever again be permitted to decide the shape of his week. His daughter had a school recital on the 14th. He intended to be in the third row. The last time I watched him cross that lobby, on a cold morning in November, the lobby manager who had stood there 19 years saw him coming from 40 feet away and moved fast, keying the executive elevator, holding the doors, gesturing him toward the polished car with the walnut interior that Victoria Ashbourne had once told him he was not entitled to enter. Gavin smiled and shook his head. "That's all right," he said. "Whichever one goes up is fine." He stepped into the service car with the scuffed panels and the freight padding on the walls, and set his old briefcase down between his feet, and the doors closed on the marble, and the 3 interlocking lines cut into the stone. Victoria Ashbourne believed that power was the ability to make another person lower themselves in front of you. Gavin Rourke proved that real power is never needing anyone to kneel at all.